Uh, Without further ado, I'm super excited about today's topic. Again, it's data related to post-fire ecosystem monitoring, and we're focusing today again on the eco-regional scale. And to learn more and have an informed discussion, we're joined today by Dr. Winslow Hansen. Dr. Hansen is part of a team who are trying to tackle some questions that are near and dear to all of our hearts. Questions like, how do we understand and measure, the kind of ecosystem we're managing in terms of resilience to wildfire? Is there a way to sort of quantify that and understand it, and maybe even predict what might happen into the future? It's a big question. And on the social side, what data might the public find compelling in our efforts, our broad efforts to improve public acceptance of prescribed burns and other types of beneficial fire, and demonstrate how those types of fire can actually improve ecosystem health and reduce risks to communities. So these are some really big questions that they're working on. Dr. Hansen is the founding director of the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative, or WFRIC, as they refer to it as. He and his team integrate field measurements, remote sensing, and process-based modeling, kind of machine learning, to understand how fires and forests may change over time, and in particular over the next century, and what it means for people who live in the West, like we do. And for 2 decades, Winslow has conducted research across Western North America, from New Mexico to Alaska. He's the assistant scientist at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies and affiliate faculty with Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology, at Columbia, and the International Arctic Research Center at University of Alaska Fairbanks. Winslow, it's so nice of you to join us today. Let's kick off this discussion with your presentation. So welcome.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation to speak. I'm really thrilled to join your group and to learn from all of you through the discussions and the question and answer period. I'm going to share my screen here and get it all set up if you give me just a moment. There we go. Great. So thanks for the wonderful introduction. That's really kind of you. I am calling in from upstate New York, which may seem a little weird talking about Western fire, but you go where the paycheck is. And I grew up in Montana and have been doing research in the West for a long time. Met my wife living up in Alaska. And so while we're not physically there, our hearts are always out West. So I'm going to be talking to you today about part of the efforts we've been doing under this new program called the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on our efforts to improve our ability to track how forests and fire regimes are changing using remote sensing from space. But of course, before we jump into any conversation about fire and our current situation and future outlook, it's so important to always remember that Western US forests have burned for millennia. Tree species are adapted to their historical fire regimes. They need fire in many contexts. This is just one example. So you saw in this video a massive stand replacing fire that happened north of Seattle a few years ago in the wet, productive forests of the Western Cascades. And you can see from this image here that many of the trees in the overstory are killed, right? Like if you were uninformed, perhaps you'd think it's a moonscape. But if you zoom in on that forest floor, as we did nerding out at this location, it's just littered with tree seedlings of the same species that was there in the overstory. Those tree seedlings are experiencing a flush of light, nutrients, water, and they're going to establish and grow back to a forest that's very much functionally and structurally similar to what was there before the fire. So that's that broad, long historical context. But we also know that in the last few decades, we've seen big increases in fire activity, largely driven by climate change, as well as a densification of fuels that are a legacy of a century of fire suppression and the extirpation of cultural burning of indigenous communities for thousands of years in many forest types. So this is a figure showing from 1984 to present the annual area burned in forests. This covers the satellite record, and you can see that we've seen, over 1,000% increase in annual area burned driven by climate change. 2020, of course, is still our record year up here, and it's, truly extraordinary compared to the historical record. And already, this is really causing pretty serious challenges, straining society, it's straining ecosystems. I put just a few examples up here. These could be replaced by many others. So, of course, we had the Labor Day fires in Oregon and Washington that burned thousands of structures, has led to billions of dollars in lawsuits against the utility company. Closer to home for you, of course, the Camp Fire, the devastation of burning paradise and the smoke that was produced. Over in Colorado, the Grizzly Creek Fire caused $100 million in road damage and closed I-70 for 2 weeks. And then in northern New Mexico, the Las Conchas Fire caused huge areas, acres and acres of ponderosa pine forest to convert permanently to shrubland and grassland. And now, more than a decade later, it remains that way. So, like pretty dire. And when we look to the future, unfortunately, it looks only more dire. By the end of the 21st century, the projections suggest the risk of extreme drought in the West could triple as compared to a pre-industrial baseline. And that record year of 2020, that extraordinary year in terms of annual area burned, is expected to become the annual average area burned by 2050. Now, decision makers, practitioners, politicians, broad bucket of decision makers are all tasked with stewarding society and ecosystems during this time of profound challenge. Not an easy task. And folks are really in need of better information, best-in-class ecological science to understand how our forests and fire regimes are changing, why, and what we might do to ameliorate the consequences. So a couple of years ago, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation approached us to think about putting together a research program that could help support decision makers during this really difficult time by providing science. And 2 years later, we are now an operational organization called the Western Fire and Forest Resilience Collaborative. We're a group of 10 science teams, mainly in the Western United States at universities that conduct research on everything from field ecology to broad scale climate dynamics and remote sensing of fire. And we're all unified around this overarching question of how can we accelerate advancements in fire ecology and forest resilience science to really ensure decision makers have the information they need to make these challenging decisions. And we're guided by two goals. So the first is to conduct convergent, actionable research that's done in partnership with decision makers. And then second, to try to help catalyze innovation among the broader fire science community through open science best practices, through collaboration, and through convening and discussion. When we kicked this off 2 years ago and we decided, we really need to do this work in partnership with decision makers, it became really clear, well, the first step is we got to go talk to decision makers. So a collaborator and I just picked up the phone and started calling anybody who would answer. Over the course of the summer, we did 19 interviews with decision makers across the Western United States. These were folks in state and federal agencies, NGOs. We talked with some folks at boundary organizations, some politicians. And we took those interviews and worked with some professionals, social scientists, to help distill that down into just 4 knowledge gaps that seem to be really constraining decision making. We took those knowledge gaps and then hosted a town hall at UCLA where we brought together 20 scientists and 20 decision makers to further explore those research gaps and really try to interrogate and see if they stick. And then once we felt pretty good about those, at least in the California context, then we ran 4 regional focus groups on Zoom with 3 to 10 participants in each of the focus groups, one in the Southwest, one in the Southern Rockies, one in the Northern Rockies, and one in the PNW to explore how these knowledge gaps aligned with more local needs. So I'm just going to walk through the gaps really quick to set the context. The first gap that we heard from decision makers is that there's really a need for metrics that can characterize the spectrum of fire effects on our landscapes from beneficial to detrimental. So, of course, in the beginning of this talk, I really focused quite a bit on the detrimental aspects. But if you remember my first slide, fires are critical in these forest ecosystems. And even today, a surprising amount of burned area in forests is beneficial wildfire that's revitalizing forests, reducing fuel loads, totally in line with historical conditions. This video here is just showing one example of where folks went in Eastern Washington, did some mechanical thinning, and then that allowed fire to be introduced back into this stand, well in line with historical conditions. Now, this is obviously pretty tough. It's, a tall order. There's lots of different dimensions that can go into defining beneficial fire, but decision makers felt that this was really quite essential for being able to communicate to the public the role that wildfires can play and how we can leverage wildfires to do good work to reduce fuels and the risk of fast destructive fires in the future. The second gap that we identified with decision makers is that there seems to be a need to develop indicators that will help us predict forest resilience prior to a fire occurring. So this is another forest that experienced high severity fire in Eastern Washington, just 50 miles away from the previous video. This was a wildfire stand replacing a low elevation tree line, and it was, a decade ago. And if you walk through this stand, you won't find a single tree seedling. There's just nothing. Despite the fact that there's obviously mature seed source right around the edges. It's just too hot and dry now to support reestablishment of forest. So again, not an easy task, right? Like ecologists have been trying to operationalize resilience for decades and have not been particularly effective at it. There's a lot of social and biophysical factors that contribute to the resilience of a stand. But decision makers felt that this was also really critical for helping to inform planning and also to help convey the potential impact of these unprecedented investments that we're seeing by the federal government in mechanical thinning and prescribed burning. So how do we measure return on investment in terms of forest health or resilience from our actions today? The third gap that we identified is a need for better predictions in the near term and longer term projections of how fire and ecosystems were likely to change over days to decades. So decision makers, of course, emphasized that being able to forecast fires in forests in the near term was really important for tactical decision making. For example, how are we going to allocate critical resources across the West in any given fire season? But they were also really interested in understanding how the actions we're taking today were likely to affect forest structure, function, and fires decades from now when our kids are walking through these forests. And then the final gap is transferability. So we know that if you're walking around measuring things in a past fire in Arizona, there's going to be a lot of differences from if you're doing the same thing in Yellowstone National Park, but there also are some similarities. And so how can we take lessons learned in one place and apply them to other places? This is really important also for a resource equity perspective. So I was just looking at the numbers a couple weeks ago, and California, Oregon, and Washington have a combined GDP that's 2.6 times larger than the rest of the Western United States. That means that there is greater research capacity, more workforce development opportunities, and better preparation for fire management. How can we take the momentum and lessons we're learning in these well-resourced states to help along under-resourced states? These gaps helped us define 5 objectives that are going to guide WFRIC for the next 5 to 10 years in terms of our research and stakeholder engagement. So the first objective is to continue to cultivate and nurture a community of practice with decision makers so we know how decision makers' needs are evolving over this long period, but also so that we have relationships of trust in place so that we can continue to inject science into decision making as it becomes available. We're investing a lot in starting field campaigns and field experiments and some modeling work to really try to get a better understanding of what are the mechanisms that underpin forest resilience, with the hopes that that will help us do a better job at predicting where forest resilience may be eroding. We're, as I'll talk about more in a little bit, working a lot on improving our ability to track how forests and fire regimes are changing from space in a little bit more real time and at fine spatial resolution. And then we're feeding that remote sensing information into process-based simulation models so that we can make predictions and projections into the future at the individual tree to region-wide scale of how our forests and fire regimes are likely to change through the end of this century. And then finally, because of course, all of us rely on forests in the West, we're really interested in quantifying the impacts for critical ecosystem services. So the effects on air quality and who and where people are exposed, the effects on carbon storage, which is so important for climate mitigation, the effects on water quantity and quality, which is of course is essential in the arid West, effects on biodiversity, et cetera. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to try to make this a little bit more concrete because it's, a broad set of research projects, and we're going to focus specifically on this tracking forest and fire piece. And I'm going to highlight two projects. So these are projects being led by my collaborators. I'm merely the voice that's telling their story. But I hope to be able to answer the questions you have. And if I can't answer questions on the technical details, we can put you in contact with the folks that are actually executing this research. So two projects. The first is going to be focused on explaining how we're trying to improve our ability to track changes in forest carbon on an annual basis. And this is a project that's being led by a research associate in my group, Dr. Jaslyn Hall, in collaboration with a Forest Service researcher, Andy Hudak. And then we'll talk a little bit about our efforts to better track ecologically beneficial versus detrimental fire. And this is a collaboration that's led by Jennifer Balch at the University of Colorado and Brian Harvey at the University of Washington. All right, so let's get into tracking forest change. At the field level, we really have an amazing resource in the United States because of the Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis Plot Network. This is a plot network of roughly 160,000 plots across the CONUS that are sampled every 5 to 10 years and are meant to take the pulse of forest health. So, an extraordinary resource to have. Unfortunately, there's some challenges with it when we think about going from this plot network to trying to create wall-to-wall maps of changes in forest structure and carbon and other variables we might care about. The first is that FIA plots, in order to protect private landowner privacy, have a certain percentage of the plots that are fuzzed and swapped. So you don't actually know where the true location is, which of course makes it a little tough. And then because they're sampled every 5 to 10 years, it makes it tough to get a sense of annual change over time. So what our group has been doing is trying to leverage the strength of those plot networks, combine it with various types of remote sensing to maximize the strength and minimize the downsides. And how collaborators are doing that is first they've tried to put together a catalog of as much LiDAR data as they could find across the Western United States. So you can see that map here. And what they're doing is they're relating the plot network data to the LiDAR data to create models with the LiDAR data of tree above ground biomass or carbon. The next step is then to assume that that LiDAR-based model of above ground biomass is truth, and then build a sequent model using machine learning where we try to predict the LiDAR-based estimates of above ground biomass using Landsat, which then allows us to go wall to wall, 30-meter resolution, and also estimate annual change. So this approach, this workflow has actually worked out really well, and our collaborator Andy Hudak has produced these data, and they will be available soon. but it's only total above ground biomass, right? It's like all the biomass in a given grid cell. And of course, we know that from a fire perspective, the kind of biomass matters a lot, right? Fine fuels are way more flammable than big snags that are still standing. So the next step that we're working on now is trying to break out that total biomass into more fine scale pools. And specifically, we're starting on trying to break it into the biomass that's associated with green vegetation. So this is your healthy forest, non-photosynthetic vegetation. So this would be dead trees that are, maybe killed by beetles or drought. And then the places where we're seeing declining health. So maybe there's an outbreak of insects that's ongoing and these trees are circling the drain. And by the nice thing is, as you can see in these pictures, there's spectral indices of these different types of forests are unique. And so we're using an approach called spectral mixture analysis to try to separate out what proportion of the total biomass can be associated with each of these pools within 30-meter pixels. Results are churning away as we speak, and we're testing the models and making adjustments so results to be forthcoming over coming years. Following a kind of similar workflow, we're also trying to improve our ability to track beneficial versus detrimental effects of fire from at least an ecological perspective. So some of you may know that, the US government has done a wonderful job of leveraging Landsat to track fire severity across the observational record from 1984 roughly to today. It lags a couple years. This is the monitoring trends and burn severity data set. The challenge with this data set is that it produces indices of burn severity that are really hard for somebody on the ground to conceptualize and to understand. So things like RDNBR, where even as a fire ecologist that's been working in this space for many years, I couldn't go out and do a stand on the ground and tell you this burned at this RDNBR. It's not very functional. And so what we're trying to do is, again, leverage big inventories of field data sets where people have measured on the ground burn severity, in this initial context, a variable we call composite burn index, or CBI, and then relate that to the Landsat indices of burn severity to produce more functional maps of burn severity that people can interpret. CBI is an index where a fire ecologist goes out into the field and assesses the soil burn severity, the understory severity, and the overstory severity, and it creates this aggregate index. So you can separate out high severity stand replacing fires from low severity fires. And one of the applications we've been using to do this is work that is in prep and just about to be submitted, is try to then classify acres burned into beneficial versus detrimental fire from an ecological perspective. So how did we do that? Well, we looked at the record from 2010 to 2020, and we said, okay, if a grid cell burned at low severity during this contemporary period, and our historical understanding of the system suggests that this should have burned at low severity pre-Euro-American settlement, we consider that beneficial fire. Similarly, if a pixel burned at high severity during our contemporary period, but we also know historically from pollen records and other records that it burned as high severity in the past, then we also consider that ecologically beneficial. And then finally, the category where pixels burned as high severity fire, but we thought historically they should have burned at low severity, that would be classified as detrimental or inconsistent with the historical fire regime. So using this framework at the pixel level, we're able to map out where that beneficial and detrimental fire happened. So you can see a map of across the West and look at the percentage within each forest fire perimeter of how much burned by good fire. And then you can see the spatial patterning and heterogeneity within a single fire perimeter here for the August complex fire in California. And when we do this, what we find is that actually a very large percentage of the total area that burned between 2010 and 2020 actually burned in beneficial fire that's well in line with the historical fire regime, doing good work of revitalizing ecosystems, reducing fuel loads, reducing the risk of catastrophic climate-driven destructive fires in the future. Now, CBI is a good step forward, right? Like, at least we measure it in the field, but it's still not particularly interpretable. It's still an aggregated index. And so our next steps that we're working on now are to try to improve this by providing multiple perspectives that you can view, multiple lenses that you can view into this beneficial versus detrimental fire question. And we're doing that in two ways. So first, we're going to create a more integrated framework that considers both fire behavior, so the speed of fires, the intensity of those fires as they're burning, as well as the fire severity. So that's the ecological effects of that fire after it's burned. And second, we're going to really blow out the variables that we can actually model in terms of fire severity. So instead of just CBI, we're building models that include things like proportion of the tree stems are killed, or the distance to mature seed source that would ensure post-fire regeneration, deep wood charring, canopy cover change. These things that a forester who goes out in the woods every day is really going to understand and be able to relate to and measure. So with that, I'd just like to say thanks so much. I know I ran slightly over time, but not terribly. I would just want to highlight that while this research was based on a couple collaborators, the WIFRIC is a much larger group of co-PIs, each of them frighteningly brilliant, totally engaged, enthusiastic, and responsive. And it's really been such a pleasure to work with all of them and to think about working with them into the future. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you have, and I look forward to the discussion through the rest of the time we have together. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Wonderful. Winslow, thank you so much.
Wow.
Yeah, all those brilliant people you're working with, they've chosen a good mouthpiece. You told a great story there.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask the working group in a moment to ask questions, but I thought I'd just kick us off with a couple that are sort of burning for me. Um, let's talk a little bit more about how these methods and products, I'm thinking in particular about the use of the composite burn index, how they can be used to demonstrate the effects of prescribed burning on future wildfire severity across, say, a county, like a Western county. How do you envision how these could be sort of deployed that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is real opportunity with these types of products to actually leverage both the forest carbon and
Mm,
the burn severity data. So one approach you might do is to look and prescribe burns in a given county and to look at how much of that would be classified as beneficial fire in line with the historical fire regime. We would expect with prescribed fire um, that it would be well in line with the conditions that we're hoping for, right? Because
mm,
experts are lighting them, they know what they're doing. But then you could also look afterwards at how the forest carbon, those fuels, changed.
mm,
And then, as we build up a record of understanding over time, you can start to see how when wildfires ignite in those places, that county, when they intersect with our prescribed burns, what are the impacts in terms of fire severity?
mm,
So I think it provides a really wonderful framework for really starting to rigorously assess the efficacy of treatments, how we place treatments on the landscape, what the retreatment interval needs to be for prescribed burning, and as well as like how can we leverage these beneficial wildfires that, often cost a fraction of what prescribed burning costs per acre
mhm.
to do the good work that needs to be done to ensure communities remain safe, that we can live sustainably in a much more fiery future.
Let's talk about urban versus rural. I'm asking because the Bay Area is sort of, it's like a third is urbanized, and about two-thirds is natural. But even that two-thirds is fragmented. And so some of the places that you were using as sort of demonstrating were, national forests. And however, I mean, I see these tools as being just as valuable to managers of land here in the Bay Area as they are to the Forest Service. So I'm curious, As someone who's a forest scientist and a spatial scientist, when you think of the Bay Area and our sort of development patterns here, what what challenges do you think exist for deploying these kind of methods in a place like the Bay Area?
Yeah, that's also a great question. I think in terms of challenges, um, there's always challenges with taking really broad regional products and using them at much finer scales, right?
Mhm.
So when we summarize or extrapolate to a finer scale, it can make it a little bit challenging, and particularly in landscapes where we have lots of fragmentation, right? So even within a 30-meter grid cell, maybe you have many different land cover types. That can make it a little bit tough. But I also see it as like a framework for opportunities to improve that kind of analyses. So, Landsat is what we have today, which is a
Mhm.
30-meter resolution, but
Mhm.
there are already satellites that have been launched that have 10-meter resolution that can be leveraged for this type of work as their records expand over time.
Mhm.
And future satellites are being launched that have even a 1-meter resolution. So by understanding the algos, the machine learning algorithms to build these connections, then we're ready when those platforms come online to be able
Mhm.
to provide even finer scale information that could really help target management actions in these highly fragmented landscapes.
Thank you for both of those great answers. I've got a couple of other questions, but I want to open it up to the working group. Any questions that folks have for Winslow? Feel free to just take yourself off mute.
I'll go. Thanks so much, Winslow. That was great. Lots of good stuff happening. I can go all the way back to the social science part of this, and kudos for bringing a social scientist in the beginning and not at the end. um, but could you talk a little bit more about the science that came out of that? In particular, I'm thinking about like what these decision makers who they were and what they'll actually do with these data once you're done. What are the decisions they're actually making for which these data will help them?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And out of the things that keep me up at night, that's one of the top ones. Like, are we really building relationships of trust that will lead to this data being useful and used? So we put a lot of effort into that. Just a little bit of context. So we worked with a social scientist in the beginning and learned a lot. And we took a pretty much a shotgun approach, as I alluded to, of like, who will answer the phone? Trying to learn the landscape, trying to start those relationships. Subsequently, we hired a deputy director of policy and management. So they're second in charge of the whole organization, my right hand. And they have more than 15 years of experience working in boundary organizations. The Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington is where they were previously, where their whole job was to take science, work with decision makers, find the right scientists, pair them up, and then produce products that are useful for those decision making contexts from the very beginning. So she's already, jumping in with both feet in terms of building those relationships out and starting to really understand what kinds of derivative products would be most useful and most accessible for people at different levels of decision making, from local counties up to DC Forest Service folks. One thing about the Moore Foundation initiative, which is really fascinating, it's a much broader initiative from just us, right? Focused on fire resilience, is they're funding these things called the Sparks, Select Pilots to Achieve Resilience by Key Indicators. And essentially what this is it's asking the question, if you find counties and watersheds that have made a lot of momentum towards living sustainably with fire, if you infuse with resources, both financial and capacity building, can you actually bend the needle, and can they serve as lighthouses for other groups to learn from? And so in many ways, that is a built-in stakeholder for us. And so we are working very closely with those sparks. There's 10 of them across the West to make sure that they have the data that they need, the science that they need to make these decisions.
Awesome, thank you.
Other questions from the group?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
This is Lily with the State Coastal Conservancy, and Winslow, thank you. I learned so much. It was a delight listening to you. It's great that everyone's working on this. Just a lot of gratitude coming from me. My question is, we at the state are investing in fine scale veg mapping, which is pretty high quality data, I hope. Kind of all across the state and across the region. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you think that'll be impactful and how you think it'll fold into these broader efforts or anything kind of like that. I'd really appreciate it.
Yeah. In many ways, from a data perspective, you all are so lucky to be based in California. The amount and quality of the data that's available at the state level is unprecedented. It's shocking. And that is a really valuable resource. So, when we think about working in California, we really want to leverage all of that momentum that's already been built and to be complementary. But we also want to think about states that don't have those resources and don't have that information. And so we're really trying to build around California as almost the tail that wags the dog to be able to provide other states equally valuable information. So from that vegetation specifically perspective, I didn't talk about it much at all, but we also do a lot of simulation modeling where we use software on computers to simulate into the future what forests may look like and how they might change with climate change and fire. And you got to start those models somewhere, right? Like you can't just start from bare ground. And so we often start with those vegetation layers, like you're talking about, as the initial conditions that then we shoot the models off into the future from. And it's just such a delight when there's really high quality vegetation data to be able to set up your models with landscapes that people who know the landscapes can actually look and be like, oh yeah, that looks right. Right, there's some lodgepole over there, aspen over there. Absolutely, this map looks wonderful. So that information is just absolutely essential and so valuable.
Great. Thanks. Happy to hear it.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Lily. Other questions from the group? Steve.
Hi, and thanks for having me on such short notice. This is my first meeting at together in this group, and I'm a forester. I work in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and super appreciate the information that you generated. And I missed one thing you said in the opening, Winslow. I think that you said that there were so many acres that had burned, and what you're seeing is turned to grassland and maybe not seedlings coming back. And did you attribute an acres to that in the West, or?
Great question. No, we
Oh,
didn't attribute any acres to that.
okay.
That would be a really great analysis to do. It's really tough though across
Yeah,
the West, right? Because as you know, I'm sure better than I do, when you have a fire and there's a lot of grass and shrub, those seedlings don't poke their head out above the grass for 10, 15, sometimes 20 years. And
right.
so it can be really hard to use remote sensing to even see whether forests are coming back or not. Um, there have been some like kind of interesting analyses in California, specifically in the Sierras, that use pretty complicated techniques of like past records compared to current climate. And they estimate that if 20% of the forests in the Sierra Nevadas burn, those places would not come back as forests today, which, is pretty striking. They call it, you know, zombie forests, forests that are the walking dead. But we don't have West-wide estimates of how much is already transitioning to grass and shrub and where that's happening.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. I was straining to look at the map. We've been doing a lot of work in the CZU fire in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and I was straining to look at the one map where it showed a good fire versus bad fire, and I was trying to see if that little blip had gone to gold or whether it was considered good or bad fire. I mean, a lot of our, I don't know if we're, I don't know if we're necessarily seeing areas that you could really say are, well, I'd say what we are seeing is that definitely in the vegetation transition zones where the fire was leaving kind of like that lower severity area into the upper slopes where it really got heated up and really got pushed on with the winds, like there is a high degree of mortality. And sometimes in the hardwood stands, like nobody survived, you know, if you'll excuse the anthropomorphism. But one thing that you might be able to see on your, if you're looking in composite burn index in the fire, is the footprint of the Lockheed fire, which was about an 8,000 acre burn, and this might be too small scale for you, but was an 8,000 acre burn that was within the CZU. And about 3 weeks after the CZU fire had started, there was some of the first images of, you know, what the burn looked like. And you can see the Lockheed fire footprint clear as day, just white ash, you know, where areas that burned hot in the Lockheed fire, and that was in 2008, starting to forget these things. A lot of those areas that burned severely were lots of ceanothus, and there were some microclimates developing under the ceanothus where seedlings were trying to come back or ferns were trying to come back, but the dead stands over the top. Trees died, tops fell off into the ceanothus, and the fire frequency was just high and went through and just burned it super hot. And so you can kind of see that, you know, and in some cases we'll show that photo to show that it's like, well, if it continues to get hotter and drier and we get more fires, like we'll probably see more of this, especially in the reburns. But if it gets cooler and wetter, and I know that the data doesn't totally support that, then we might see a transition like from the previous fire that occurred in that area was like 1948 in the Pine Mountain fire. So I'll stop there, but I find what you're doing super interesting, and really appreciate the opportunity to listen to what you have to say, and just think about the correlations that we're doing in our region and in our area too. So thanks so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for those insights and observations. You know, that's one of the things that we didn't talk much about, but we're trying to move towards, is these reburns. So, you know, regardless of fire severity, if you get whammed by 2 fires right in a row before you have any seed source on site, or your trees are just little saplings, or as you're talking, ceanothus fields, there's very likely to be little regeneration in those places.
Thanks,
Steve, it's so good to have you here. And Winslow, if you haven't already made the mental connection, Steve is a fantastic person to check in with if you're wanting to validate your models in the Santa Cruz Mountains.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
I really appreciate that. Thanks, Tom. Glad to be here.
absolutely.